Welcome to Newshour. Today has been the final day of the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in South Africa. It's been an event where multilateralism has been fiercely defended and the continent of Africa has confidently reasserted itself. President Cyril Ramaphosa has told G20 foreign ministers that a commitment to multilateralism and international law is vital to solving global crises. He also demanded that Africa must have more of a voice as the world's most serious global challenges, including conflicts and climate change, are discussed. South Africa is the first African state to ever hold the G20. Let's take a look at the event in more detail.
The G20 Foreign Ministers meeting in Johannesburg takes place against the backdrop of increasing global and regional tensions. While discussions focus on global economic stability, multilateralism and trade, Africa is also facing a complex set of challenges that make this summit particularly significant for the continent.
Geopolitical tensions and rising intolerance, conflict and war, climate change, pandemics and energy and food insecurity do threaten an already fragile global coexistence.
Africa is currently dealing with multiple crises. The civil war in Sudan has led to one of the world's worst humanitarian emergencies, displacing over 8 million people. In the Sahel region, ongoing armed insurgencies and military coups have created widespread instability. Meanwhile, economic challenges, including high inflation, soaring debt levels, and unemployment, have triggered protests in major economies like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. Despite these difficulties, Africa remains a key player in the global economy. The continent is rich in natural resources, and its young and rapidly growing population presents opportunities for investment and economic expansion. However, leaders argue that Africa has not received sufficient support from major economies to address its economic and environmental challenges. South Africa, as the first African country to hold the G20 presidency, is using this platform to push for stronger representation of developing nations in global economic decision-making. President Cyril Ramaphosa has emphasized the need for reforms in international financial institutions, greater investment in Africa's infrastructure, and more inclusive policies in global trade agreements.
It is significant that the G20 Leaders Summit later this year will be convened for the first time on African soil. This in many ways highlights the growing importance of the African continent in global economic, political and environmental discussions.
The meeting also takes place amid growing geopolitical tensions within the G20 itself. Russia-Ukraine war continues to divide member states, while shifts in US foreign policy under President Donald Trump have raised further questions about the future of global cooperation. The absence of key US officials at the summit, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has drawn international attention. South Africa will hold the G20 presidency until November 2025. As discussions continue, analysts will be watching closely to see whether this year's summit can produce concrete agreements on trade, security, and economic support for developing nations. The final outcomes of these meetings are expected to shape global policy decisions in the months ahead.
Well, let's dig a bit deeper now with Isaac Lukando, who is in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania for us and has been following this story. Isaac, really nice to speak to you there. What key issues then have been on the agenda today, day two, the final day of this meeting?
Well, according to the schedule that was shared, there were 2 or 3 things that were on the schedule. One, of course, is the ministerial meeting that was on the agenda, and of course you saw all those ministers that had gathered there. We informed that there were about 15 countries that were represented out of the 20, and of course one of them is the African Union, also as a member of the G20 since 2023. Another thing that was expected today is a virtual meeting of the deputies to draft a communique of all that has been discussed, but you also expected all these meetings on the sidelines of the meeting. So we've seen different countries, their ministers coming together to discuss different issues of concern at this particular forum. But we also had a working group on culture that was expected to meet as well today on the second day of this particular meeting. And this is one of about 130 meetings that are expected to take place throughout the year. This is often not seen, but it is one of the many meetings that are expected to take place as South Africa holds the presidency for 2025.
Now, Isaac, given the US's significant role in global geopolitics and also in the G20, how has the US's absence impacted the event?
Well, according to Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, that hasn't impacted the meeting that much, although the absence of the United States has been felt. And you heard in his address yesterday that yes, their not being there has dealt a blow in a certain sense, in the sense that they could have had some meaningful discussions, that they could have had some contributions, but that won't deter them from moving forward. And so essentially he downplayed the effect of the US not being there in terms of their top officials. The US was represented, but only by embassy officials within South Africa. So in terms of how this transitions at the end of the year, when South Africa hands over to the United States in November as chair of the G20, that might be problematic. But in terms of sharing all these details and the logistics of all of that, at least they will have some form of representation. But according to what South Africa is saying and what other delegates that we've heard from, they've seemed to downplayed it a little bit and not giving it too much power, but definitely being felt and being talked about in various circles at this particular meeting.
Okay, downplayed, but South Africa undeterred, as you say. But nevertheless, though, clearly some issues may or may not be a rather awkward handover. How do you foresee the future of bilateral relations between the US and South Africa? Do you foresee improvement in the near future?
Well, relations might be a little bit difficult to mend between them because it appears that the rift is a little bit deep, as expressed by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. The fact that he didn't come was based on what he termed as differences in policies. South Africa has set a tone for this meeting in terms of the themes that it communicated. It said it had wanted to focus on solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And you see this coming to the fore in terms of how, for example, developing countries, especially those in Africa, are included in the financial architecture of the world. For example, things like health, things like climate change. And clearly there are differences in terms of how the US views these things. For example, in climate change, the US is obviously not interested in the Paris Agreement on climate change. And while South Africa, representing many African countries, 55 African countries, is pushing for more action on climate change, and with countries, for example, in East and Southern Africa experiencing the brunt of those effects of climate change. And so there is a clear difference between them, even in terms of how they handle geopolitics. Places like the war in Gaza, in places like Ukraine, with Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine expected to visit South Africa. This is obviously creating a greater rift between the United States and South Africa. So there are a lot of issues to mend, a lot of issues to talk about, and it's not something that may be mended as soon as possible. It might take some time, but as communicated by the South African president, his country is already taking steps towards mending the rift between the two countries, but definitely not something that can be done overnight.
And Isaac, like a lot of these big events, very often it's the side event where some of the more interesting deals are done, agreements are forged. What other high-level meetings are taking place on the sidelines of this G20 summit?
Well, we've seen some meetings take place between, for example, India and China. They were discussing about ensuring there's tranquility along their shared border. We saw that meeting going on between the foreign ministers of those two countries. Also, interestingly, India talking to Russia about its role in finding a solution to the conflict in Ukraine. India now stating that it wants to have a place on the table to try to seek a solution, reflecting the statement recently by its Prime Minister Narendra Modi on being a player and being on the side of peace, initially having taken the stance of neutrality, but now it wants to be seen as advocating for peace in Ukraine. So that also took place. But you also see China and Russia talking on the sidelines, the foreign ministers meeting and discussing their ties with the US, and of course on the table the conflict in Ukraine. It seems to have gone somewhat well with the two ministers agreeing that the foreign minister of China is to visit Russia in the not too distant future. So these are some of the dealings that have gone on. And of course, it must be understood that this particular forum will inform other bigger forums, like, for example, in the United Nations, where critical decisions will have to be made that will affect geopolitics. And so some of these dealings that are taking place in meetings like this are very critical to what we will eventually see on the ground in places like Ukraine.
And Isaac, you mentioned Ukraine there, obviously a major topic at this G20 summit. Is there any realistic chance of the parties reaching a consensus on the right way forward when it comes to ending the conflict?
Well, what we've seen from this two-day meeting is that there are areas of convergence and there are areas of divergence. There is no clear-cut solution to this. We, for example, heard from the UK Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, that he didn't believe during a closed session that involved Russia, that Russia itself was keen on seeing peace come to Ukraine. In his words, he said that to achieve peace was a simple act of Russia simply moving out of Ukraine. And so he presented an image to the effect that there are different opinions on how to achieve peace in Ukraine. It appears, based on the discussions that were had between Russia and the United States under the auspices of Saudi Arabia, there appears to be some sort of consensus, or at least some sort of direction that maybe a deal could be reached. But the fact that Ukraine wasn't involved also begins to complicate the matter. And when you hear the UK say that they see things differently and perhaps do not believe that Russia is interested in forging peace for Ukraine, then obviously it complicates things in terms of finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict there. So we might see this play out a little bit longer than anybody else on the planet would like to see go on.
Okay, let's talk about the African influence more widely. President Ramaphosa, he spoke of the need for a bigger voice on the world stage for the whole continent. Have such sentiments been welcomed by other African nations during this event?
Well, even before coming into this particular meeting, there was definitely a consensus through the African Union, which represents 55 African nations, that some change needs to happen. And the very fact that the African Union is included as of September 2023 as a member of the G20 is pivotal in terms of seeing steps towards change on the African continent. African countries, I should say, have had some grievances, particularly in the financial architecture of the world. There have been complaints about how debt is structured. Many African countries complain that they're mired in debt. As of 2023, the IMF said that at least half of African countries had or were at risk of defaulting on the debt that they owe. And the argument that African countries are giving is that this debt, the interest rates that they pay on the debt that they take on for development projects is a little bit higher than what other nations around the world pay. And so they're calling for the restructuring of the global financial architecture and to be seen also as equals on the table, hence the theme, solidarity, equality, and sustainability. There are also issues, of course, on climate change, which the African Union agrees must see some urgent action. So for there to be a forum such as this one, there's definitely agreement amongst Africans at the time is now to take action. But whether that will actually see traction or the speed that most African nations would like to see is a different question. Obviously, given our discussion here, that there are differing views on how to go about that. But for many African countries, there is a sigh of relief that at least for now, there is a place at the table to discuss some of the pressing issues for Africa.
A place at the table, at least for now. Isaac, thank you very much indeed for bringing us up to speed. Isaac Lakandu for us there in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of NewsHour. Please do stay with us for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, we wish you a pleasant evening ahead.